It was supposed to be a routine drive. I'd done this route a dozen times before. Nothing but open highways, a few winding backroads, and the same sleepy gas stations where the coffee was always burnt and the lights flickered just a little, too much. I left just after sunset, the sky still painted in fading oranges and purples. I had a full tank, a quiet cab, and a playlist lined up for the long haul. Everything felt normal, boring even. But that's always how these stories begin, isn't it? Normal, until something shifts. Somewhere between Charleston and Beckley, the GPS began acting up. The voice that usually chirped clear directions fell, silent, replaced by static for a few seconds. Then, it rerouted me. "Faster route found," it said. I glanced down, saw that it shaved about 20 minutes off my drive, and tapped to accept. Who wouldn't? Time saved is money saved. And besides, I wasn't in the mood for another truck stop meal or dragging this trip longer than it had to be. At first, the new route seemed fine, narrower, sure, but nothing I hadn't handled before. I passed through a stretch of road lined with trees so dense the canopy above blocked out the moonlight. My high beams barely pierced the darkness ahead, like I was driving through a tunnel, carved out of shadows. There were no signs, no mile markers, just the sound of tires on old pavement and the occasional rustle in the woods beyond. I started to wonder if I'd ever taken this road before, but I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just a back road only the GPS knew about. About 15 minutes in, I realized I hadn't seen another car since I turned onto this road. Not a tail light ahead, not a single pair of headlights behind. Nothing. Just me. That's when the unease started creeping in. Not panic, just that small itch in the back of your mind that tells you something isn't right. I tried the radio, thinking music might shake it off. But all I got was static, no matter what station I turned to. Not even that familiar country station that usually played in the middle of nowhere. Dead silence. Then I passed a sign, or what used to be a sign. The metal post was still there, leaning slightly, but whatever had been written on the board was completely worn away, like time itself had erased the letters. I slowed a little, squinting into the darkness, wondering if I'd missed a turn. The GPS was still showing a straight path ahead, but the screen looked off, dimmer than usual, like the battery was dying, even though it was plugged in. I checked. My phone next. No service, no bars, just a spinning wheel where the signal should be. That's not too unusual in the mountains, but something about it felt heavier this time, like I'd passed into a place I wasn't supposed to find. Then, the road narrowed again. The trees pressed in tighter, and the air, God, the air felt thick. Not with fog or mist, but with something I couldn't name. Like breathing through wet wool. I turned off the music entirely, just to hear the world around me. But the world gave nothing back. No birds, no crickets, no wind, just the steady hum of my engine, and the sense that I had gone somewhere that didn't want to be found. Gripped the wheel a little tighter and kept going, because what else could I do? Turn around? The thought had occurred to me, sure, but there was nowhere to pull off. No intersections, no driveways, just road. Endless, quiet road. I told myself it was fine. Just a shortcut. Just a strange patch of land. Nothing more. But something deep in my chest had already started to tighten. Something primal. Like an old warning that didn't use words. And I hadn't even reached the worst of it yet. I don't remember the exact moment the air changed, but I remember how it felt. 1 second, I was driving through the woods with my headlights cutting through the dark like blades, and the next, it was as if I had crossed into a different kind of silence. Deeper, heavier. It wasn't just that the forest was quiet. It was that everything felt paused. Even the engine seemed to hum differently, like it was straining under a weight I couldn't see. That's when I looked down at the dashboard and noticed the clock 1:14 a.m. I'd been checking the time periodically since I left, tracking how long I'd been on the road. Something about driving through unfamiliar areas at night makes you extra aware of time. But this time, when I looked, the clock stared back at me like a dead eye. 1:14 a.m. I kept driving. 5 minutes passed, 10, maybe more. The trees kept sliding past in that same eerie rhythm, but the clock never changed. It just stayed there. 1:14 I tapped the glass, like maybe the display had frozen. No reaction. I restarted the dash console. Nothing. That clock wasn't just stuck. It was frozen in a way that felt intentional, like the moment itself had been pinned in place. I checked my phone again, but it was still dead. Still no signal. Even the seconds hand on my old analog wristwatch had stopped moving. That's when the fear really started to creep in. Because it wasn't just one device, it was everything. All of them stopped at the exact same moment. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Maybe the area had some kind of magnetic interference. Maybe I'd driven through a place with some bizarre atmospheric anomaly. I'd heard stories like that. Places where compasses spin, watches die. But nothing I'd ever heard sounded like this, because everything around me still looked normal, at least on the surface. The trees swayed gently. My headlights stretched, ahead, reflecting off the faint mist that was starting to settle in. But it felt like the road itself wasn't moving, like I was stuck in a painting of a night drive, repeating the same mile over and over. I slowed the truck a little, unsure of what I was expecting. Maybe a turnoff, maybe a house or a sign. Something to anchor me to reality. But the deeper I went, the less real it all began to feel. I noticed that my speedometer needle was twitching. Subtle, barely noticeable, but wrong. I was holding steady on the pedal, and yet the needle danced like it didn't know what speed to settle on. 45, then 38, then back to 45 again, all in the span of seconds. The truck didn't lurch, didn't stutter, it just kept moving like normal. But the instruments were lying. The worst part was the light, not the darkness. I'd grown used to that. But the way the high beams reflected off the trees, it was too bright, too white. As if the light wasn't bouncing off bark and leaves, but something else entirely. Something smoother and less natural. I thought maybe it was fog, but fog moves. This didn't. It just hovered in the air, thick and glowing. I stared ahead and realized I could no longer tell how far I'd driven. There were no landmarks, no curves in the road, no dips or rises. Just a flat, endless path surrounded by identical trees. I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw the same thing behind me, like I hadn't moved at all, like I was stuck in a loop, and through it all, that clock refused to change. 1:14 a.m. Over and over, like a drumbeat in my mind. A moment in time that refused to let go. A minute stretched into forever. I began to notice the silence in a way I never had before. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of something else. A kind of unnatural stillness that filled the cab of the truck and seeped into my bones. Every bump of the tires on the worn asphalt seemed louder than it should have been, like the road was amplifying the smallest noises just to remind me that I was still moving. But even that started to change. The hum of the engine, once a constant comfort on long drives, became erratic. Not in its performance. It didn't stall or sputter, but in how it sounded, like I was hearing it from underwater, distant and hollow, fading in and out with no clear pattern. Then the headlights started flickering. First, a quick pulse, just once. I thought it was a trick of the trees or my own tired eyes. But then, it happened again, longer this time. A slow dimming, then a flash back to full brightness, like the truck was struggling to decide whether it wanted to illuminate the path or leave me blind. I checked the switches. Everything was normal. I hadn't touched anything. The battery was strong, and the alternator had never given me problems. But still, the lights kept twitching, fading in and out like a dying candle. I tightened my grip. On the wheel, and tried to focus. Maybe it was the damp air, some kind of interference from the heavy fog that had begun creeping in from both sides of the road. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. This wasn't weather. This was something else, something older and stranger, brushing its fingers against my world, testing it, seeing if I would notice. The dashboard lights joined in next. The glow from the gauges became uneven, pulsing like a heartbeat out of sync. My speedometer flicked, again, then dropped to 0 for a moment before jumping back up. I felt no change in speed. I was still rolling forward, still pressing the gas, but the truck no longer seemed entirely mine. The instruments that once told me what was real had turned against me, offering different stories every second. Outside the windshield, the wood seemed to press in tighter. The trees no longer looked natural. Their trunks bent at odd angles, too perfect in their spacing, too symmetrical to be random. The branches didn't sway. They reached, as if frozen in time mid-motion, like a photo held still while I moved through it. The high beams, though flickering, still worked well enough to show me that the forest ahead looked exactly like the forest behind. I couldn't tell if I was moving forward or sliding in place. I thought about pulling over, turning, around, maybe even getting out to check the lights manually. But every time I considered stopping, a pressure would build in my chest, like a warning, not a voice, not a sound, just a feeling, primal and ancient, screaming at me not to stop, not to open that door, not to step out onto the pavement. The lights dimmed once more, longer this time, nearly going out completely before flaring back to life in a harsh, sterile white that seemed colder than normal headlights should be. It made the trees glow in unnatural ways, casting shadows that bent the wrong direction and lingered a few seconds too long after the light passed. I found myself squinting, trying to make out shapes within those shadows, certain for a moment that I saw figures, tall, thin shapes that weren't there a second before, now standing between the trees, just outside the edges of the beam. My breath caught. I blinked hard. When I looked again, they were gone. Or maybe they'd never been there at all. But the silence had deepened. The flickering had become rhythmic, like the road itself was alive, and the lights were reacting to its pulse. I tried not to look too closely at the shadows. I kept telling myself it was just the flickering lights, the heavy mist, the isolation getting to my head. But even as I drove forward, every inch of me was aware of the shapes just beyond the trees. Figures that didn't move like animals or people, that didn't flinch at headlights or vanish completely when the lights passed over them. They just stood there, barely visible through the haze, tall and silent, like statues placed in the woods for no one to find. The first one I saw clearly was standing near the edge of the tree line on the right side of the road. At first, I thought it was a tree stump, just a trick of the light, but then I noticed its shape was too symmetrical, long, human-like. It didn't have distinct features. I couldn't make out a face or arms, just a black outline against the slightly lighter darkness around it. As I passed it, my headlights hit it fully for just a second, and what I saw chilled my blood. It wasn't just standing, it was watching, facing the road directly, as if waiting. I wanted to believe it was a hallucination, that I'd been driving too long, that fatigue was making my eyes play tricks on me. But a few minutes later, or however much time had passed, with the clock still frozen, I saw another. This one was on the left side of the road. Same figure, same shape, same stillness. It didn't move, not even a twitch, like it had been planted there, perfectly still, like part of the landscape. I looked into my rearview mirror, hoping not to see it again, but it was gone. My stomach turned. I started scanning both sides of the road as I drove, searching for more of them, even though part of me desperately didn't want to. And that's when I saw them. Not just one or two, but a line of them. Dozens, maybe more, lined up at irregular intervals just beyond the trees, on both sides, facing the road, spaced out like mile markers that didn't belong. None of them moved, None of them had faces, just dark silhouettes against the mist, slightly too tall to be human, slightly too narrow to be natural. The worst part was how familiar they began to look. Not in the sense that I recognized them as people I knew, but that they all seemed like echoes, like each one had once been a person, frozen in place and stripped of identity. Travelers, maybe. People who had driven this same road before me. People who had made the same wrong turn, followed the same faster route, and never made it back. The idea crawled into my mind and wouldn't leave. What if this road didn't just trap you? What if it made you part of it? I kept my hands locked on the wheel, eyes forward, forcing myself not to look at them too long, but I could feel their presence growing thicker, like the road itself was becoming crowded, not with vehicles, but with watchers. They weren't trying to stop me, not directly. They weren't chasing me or jumping out into the road. They didn't need to. Just seeing them, knowing they were there, was enough. It twisted something inside me. Deep fear, the kind you can't rationalize, the kind that comes from a place older than memory. At one point, one of the figures appeared directly in my path. I didn't see it until I was almost on top of it. A tall, unmoving silhouette standing right in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching, heart pounding against my ribs like it wanted out. The truck skidded slightly, but didn't stop entirely, and when I opened my eyes again, it was gone. No sign of it, no mark, nothing. Just the road continuing endlessly into the dark. I kept driving, unsure if I was going forward or in circles. My internal sense of direction, usually reliable from years on the road, had completely broken down. I couldn't tell if I was ascending, descending, or trapped on a flat, repeating stretch. Everything outside the truck looked the same. The trees, the mist, the faint outlines of those unmoving figures in the woods. It was all looping, or at least felt like it was. But I was too afraid to stop and test the theory. Every fibre of my being warned against coming to a full stop. Like the second I did, something would catch up to me, something I hadn't yet seen. The road began to narrow, subtly at first. The shoulders shrank until there was barely a few feet between the asphalt and the trees. Then the yellow line in the centre vanished altogether. The pavement turned rougher, older, cracked like it hadn't seen maintenance in decades. It felt like I'd been slowly lured off the map, like each mile stripped another layer of reality away. I glanced again at the GPS, and now it was nothing but a glowing blue void. No roads, no destination, no icons. Just a flat, pulsing screen, like it had given up trying to understand where I was. I realized my breathing had changed. Shallow, quick. My hands ached from gripping the wheel too tightly. I tried to loosen them, but every time I did, a noise, barely audible, would come from the woods. A sound that didn't belong in nature. Not an animal call, not the rustle of wind, but something between a low hum and a whisper. A vibration that passed through the cab and into my chest. I turned the vents off, thinking maybe it was just the air system malfunctioning, but the noise stayed. Faint, constant, almost like it was inside my head. I pushed the accelerator harder, not because I thought it would get me anywhere faster, but because I was beginning to feel that moving, any kind of motion, was the only thing keeping me tethered to something real. The truck responded, but the world outside didn't blur the way it should have at higher speeds. Everything still looked slow, like I was stuck in syrup. The trees no longer looked like they were rushing past. They just hovered, like cardboard cutouts on a conveyor belt. Then came the fog, thicker, denser, like it had a mind of its own. It rolled in from all directions, swallowing the road and my view in a matter of seconds. My headlights barely made a dent in it. I slowed down, almost to a crawl, squinting through the windshield as every instinct screamed at me to turn around. But there was nothing to turn back to. The mirrors only reflected more fog. It was like the world behind me had vanished, like the only thing that existed anymore was this road, this truck, and the space just a few feet ahead of my bumper. And through it all, the figures in the woods remained. still there, unmoving. Some seemed closer now, but it was hard to tell. The fog played tricks with distance. At one point, I thought I saw one right beside the road, mere inches from my window. But when I looked directly at it, there was only shadow and mist. Still, I didn't look again. I couldn't. My eyes started watering, and my vision blurred, but I kept staring ahead, refusing to blink more than I had to. I don't know how long I drove like that. 10 minutes, an hour, a day. Time meant nothing. My body was aching, stiff from tension, my back soaked in sweat. I felt like I was driving through the inside of a dream, a bad one that knew my name, that had chosen me. The deeper I went, the more the road lost its shape. The edges crumbled. Patches of dirt began appearing where pavement used to be. It felt like the road itself was disintegrating, unraveling the further I pushed forward. There came a moment when I was no longer sure if I was awake. Everything around me felt wrong, not just in appearance, but in sensation. The truck's cab was ice cold, yet I was sweating through my shirt. My heart thudded steadily in my chest, but the rhythm felt disconnected from the world around me, like I was out of sync with time itself. The fog had grown so thick that even the dashboard lights took on a ghostly hue, faint and distant, as if shining through layers of cloth instead of air. I kept my eyes locked on the road, or what was left of it. The asphalt was disappearing, replaced by patches of gravel and broken earth. The smooth hum of tires on pavement gave way to the crunch of stone and dirt beneath the weight of the truck. Trees leaned in closer, some of them twisted unnaturally, with limbs that reached toward the road in ways trees shouldn't. Some even appeared to have grown into the edge of the path, their roots splitting through what remained of the blacktop, like they were reclaiming it from something that didn't belong. The figures were no longer confined to the woods. I could see them now in clearer detail, closer than ever. They stood on either side of the narrowing road, some only feet from the truck, others farther back but still visible, motionless and watching. Their shapes became more defined the longer I stared. Tall, lean, wrapped in shadow like cloaks made of smoke. No faces, no eyes, just outlines of what might have once been human, or something that knew how to mimic us just well enough to disturb. I tried not to look directly at them. Every time I did, a headache pulsed behind my eyes, sharp and sudden, like a flash of heat under my skull. Something shifted in the air. It wasn't a breeze. There hadn't been any wind for miles. It was more like pressure, the kind you feel before a storm, when everything holds its breath. The fog had texture now. It swirled in unnatural patterns, forming vague spirals and shapes that evaporated the second I focused on them. And the sound returned, not a hum this time, but a slow dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground, far off in the distance, though no direction could be pinpointed. My hands started to go numb, not from cold, but from something else, like the feeling of control was being drained from me little by little. The steering wheel didn't resist, but it felt less connected. I'd turn it slightly and the truck responded, but with a delay that made my stomach drop every time. I pressed the accelerator, and there was a lag, like something between me and the engine was filtering my commands. The truck was still moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only pretending to obey. Then the sky changed. I hadn't noticed it until that moment, but somewhere along the way, the stars had disappeared. There was no moonlight, no distant glimmer in the sky above, just a uniform, endless blackness pressing down. I flicked the high beams again, hoping they'd pierce the fog better, but instead, they seemed to dim further. The light struggled, like it didn't want to reach beyond a few feet, as if the darkness wasn't just lack of light, but an actual, force-resisting illumination. I rolled down the window an inch, needing air, even if it was thick with fog. The smell that drifted in was wrong. Not rot exactly, but something stale, ancient, metallic, like rust and wet stone and something else, something that doesn't belong in any forest. I shut the window quickly, but the scent lingered, clinging, to my clothes and skin. I realized then I hadn't seen a single animal since I entered this stretch. No deer, no birds, not even the sound of insects. It was like life itself had been evacuated from the area, like the natural world had drawn a boundary here and refused to cross it.